All right, where were we? So yesterday we left off at number seven, the good door. Excuse me, the good neighbor policy. Um, and there's Roosevelt. He's with the president of Bolivia, and they're looking at this famous document from the 1930s, from 1933, the good neighbor policy. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office determined to improve relations with the nation of Central and South America. Under his leadership, the United States emphasized cooperation and trade rather than military force to maintain stability in the hemisphere. In his inaugural address on March 4th, 1933, Roosevelt stated, "In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor." Oops. No, we didn't want to do that, guys. Let's go back. This is chaos. But while trying to find that again, in the 1930s, as Roosevelt's talking about how we don't want to use our military, what is Roosevelt eventually going to be the president during World War II? So, unfortunately, Roosevelt's good neighbor policy, it had great intentions, but the reality just wasn't that happy. And we're back. All right. Um, from the top. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office determined to improve relations with the nations of Central and South America. Under his leadership, the United States emphasized cooperation and trade rather than military force to maintain stability in the hemisphere. In his inaugural address on March 4th, 1933, Roosevelt stated, "In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor, the neighbor who resolutely respects himself and, because he does so, respects the rights of others." Certainly a good goal to have. Roosevelt's Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, participated in the Montevideo Conference on December 1933, where he backed a declaration favored by most nations of the Western Hemisphere. No state has the right to intervene in the internal or external affairs of another. In December, Roosevelt stated, "The definite policy of the United States from now on is one opposed to armed intervention." Again, this is 9 years before we're less than 9 years. This is 8 years before World War II. In 1934, at Roosevelt's direction, the 1903 treaty with Cuba, based on the Platt Amendment that gave the United States the right to intervene to preserve internal stability or independence, was abrogated. Although domestic economic problems and World War II diverted attention from the Western Hemisphere, Roosevelt's good neighbor policy represented an attempt to distance the United States from earlier interventionist policies such as the Roosevelt Corollary and military interventions in the region during the 1910s and 1920s. Lesson learned. I have a hard time with this font. Number 8, the Truman Doctrine. They actually printed the Truman Doctrine in the New York Times. Oh, don't do that. But yeah, I don't know. Hopefully we'll get it pulled up here again soon. But Harry Truman, they printed the doctrine. They printed his statement in the New York Times the next day. So as soon as I can figure out why I keep Xing out of my presentations, I can show you that headline, that front page. It's pretty cool. All right, there we go. Sorry, guys. Um, the New York Times, Thursday, March something. I can't read it, guys. All the news is fit to print. Late City edition. There you go. Truman acts to save nations from red rule. Asks 400 million to aid Greece and Turkey. Congress fight likely, but approval is seen. President Harry Truman, with the Truman Doctrine in 1947, established that the United States would provide political, military, and economic assistance to all democratic nations under threat from external or internal authoritarian forces. The Truman Doctrine effectively reoriented U.S. foreign policy away from its usual stance of withdrawal from regional conflicts not directly involving the United States to one of possible intervention in faraway conflicts. So, this is a major departure from what his predecessors have done. Going all the way back to Washington, the idea was to avoid foreign entanglements. Um, but with Truman in 1947, we've officially changed our tune. The Truman Doctrine arose from a speech delivered by President Truman before a joint session of Congress on March 12th, 1947. The immediate cause for the speech was a recent announcement by the British government that, as of March 31st, it would no longer provide military and economic assistance to the Greek government with its civil war against the Greek Communist Party. Truman asked Congress to support the Greek government against the communists. He also asked Congress to provide assistance for Turkey since that nation, too, had previously been dependent on British aid. At the time, the U.S. government believed that the Soviet Union supported the Greek Communist war effort and worried that if the communists prevailed in the Greek Civil War, the Soviets would ultimately influence Greek policy. In fact, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had deliberately refrained from providing any support to the Greek communists. However, a number of other foreign policy problems also influenced President Truman's decision to actively aid Greece and Turkey. In light of the deteriorating relationship with the Soviet Union and the appearance of Soviet meddling in Greek and Turkish affairs, the withdrawal of British assistance to Greece provided the necessary excuse me, catalyst for the Truman administration to reorient American foreign policy. Accordingly, in his speech, President Truman requested that Congress provide $400 million worth of aid to both the Greek and Turkish governments and support the dispatch of American civilian and military personnel and equipment to the region. Truman justified his request on two grounds. He argued that a communist victory in the Greek Civil War would endanger the political stability of Turkey, which would undermine the political stability of the Middle East. This could not be allowed in light of the region's immense strategic importance to the U.S. national security. Truman also argued that the United States was compelled to assist, quote unquote, free peoples in their struggles against totalitarian regimes because the spread of authoritarianism would undermine the foundations of international peace and hence the security of the United States. In the words of the Truman Doctrine, it became the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Truman argued that the United States could no longer stand by and allow the forcible expansion of Soviet totalitarianism into free, independent nations because American national security now depended upon more than just the physical security of American territory. Rather, In a sharp break with its traditional avoidance of extensive foreign commitments beyond the Western Hemisphere during peacetime, the Truman Doctrine committed the United States to actively offering assistance to preserve the political integrity of democratic nations when such an offer was deemed to be in the best interest of the United States. The Eisenhower Doctrine. There's Ike Eisenhower on the table. It's a plans for Big Four meeting, Argentina situation buzzing around his ear, vaccine program. Okay, what you got, Ike? The Eisenhower Doctrine, 1957. President Dwight D. Eisenhower announced the Eisenhower Doctrine on January 1957, and Congress approved it in March of the same year. Under the Eisenhower Doctrine, a country could request American economic assistance and or aid from U.S. military forces if it was being threatened by armed aggression from another state. Eisenhower singled out the Soviet threat in his doctrine by authorizing the commitment of U.S. forces to secure and protect the territorial integrity and political independence of such nations, requesting such aid against overt armed aggression from any nation controlled by international communism. That's pretty clear who he's speaking to there. The Eisenhower administration's decision to issue this doctrine was motivated in part by an increase in Arab hostility towards the West and growing Soviet influence in Egypt and Syria following the Suez Crisis of 1956. The Suez Crisis, which had resulted in military mobilization by Great Britain, France, and Israel, as well as the United Nations against Egypt, had encouraged pan-Arab sentiments in the Middle East and elevated the popularity and influence of Egyptian presidents Gamal Abdel Nasser. President Eisenhower believed that as the result of the Suez conflict, a power vacuum had formed in the Middle East due to the loss of prestige of Great Britain and France. Eisenhower feared that this had allowed Nasser to spread his pan-Arab policies and form dangerous alliances with Jordan and Syria, and had opened the Middle East to Soviet influence. Eisenhower wanted this vacuum filled by the United States before the Soviets could step in to fill the void. Because Eisenhower feared that radical nationalism would combine with international communism in the region and threaten interests of Western nations, he was willing to commit to sending U.S. troops to the Middle East under certain circumstances. The first real test of the Eisenhower Doctrine came in 1958 in Lebanon, where the threat was not armed aggression or a direct Soviet incursion. Lebanon's president, Camille Camon, requested assistance from the United States to prevent attack from his political rivals, some of whom had communist leanings and ties to Syria and Egypt. Eisenhower responded to the request by sending U.S. troops into Lebanon to help maintain order. All right. Where were we? Still talking about the Eisenhower Doctrine. And again, like I said yesterday, I'm taking a long time. These slides, there's a lot of writing on them. So if it'd be easier for you just to click slide to slide, then by all means do that. Although Eisenhower never directly invoked the Eisenhower Doctrine, the American action in Lebanon was meant not only to help Cameron's government against its political opponents, but also to send a signal to the Soviet Union that it would act to protect its interests in the Middle East. Détente. And the E, that's supposed to have a little accent up there, but I couldn't figure out how to do that. So this takes place between 1969 and 1979. Between the late 1960s and the late 1970s, there was a thawing of the ongoing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. This détente took several forms, including increased discussion on arms control. Although the decade began with vast improvements in bilateral relations, by the end of the decade, events had brought the two superpowers back to the brink of confrontation. The ongoing nuclear arms race was incredibly expensive, and both nations faced domestic economic difficulties as a result of the diversification of resources to military research. Excuse me, diversion of resources to military research. The United States faced an increasingly difficult war in Vietnam, and improved relations with the Soviet Union were thought to be helpful in limiting future conflicts, with both sides willing to explore accommodations. The early 1970s saw a general warming of relations that was conducive to progress in in arms control talks. This font is tough for me. Détente continued. Détente led to formal agreements on arms control with the signing of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968. In 1972, the first round of strategic arms limitation talks yielded the Anti Ballistic Missile Treaty, along with an interim agreement setting caps on the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles each side could develop. In 1975, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe emerged from 2 years of intense negotiations to sign the Helsinki Final Act, which recognized political borders, established military confidence building measures, created opportunities for trade and cultural exchange, and promoted human rights. By the end of the decade, however, cracks had begun to form in the U.S. Soviet relationship. The leadership of the two countries signed a second SALT agreement, but did not ratify it, although both nations voluntarily adhered to the provisions for reduced limits on strategic weapons for years thereafter. Ultimately, the United States and the Soviet Union had different visions of what détente meant and what its pursuit would entail. And then the last one that we're going to feature today is the War on Terror. Like I said, the first major shift in public policy that I was aware of. All right, the War on Terror. There's George W. Bush. 2001. Within hours of September 11th, 2001, terror attacks. Within hours of the September 11th, 2001 terror attacks on New York and Washington, D.C., American commentators were already comparing the event to a new Pearl Harbor. The comparison of September 11th with Pearl Harbor was natural because both were surprise attacks that killed many Americans, but most interesting about it was its implication that an age of innocence and isolation had passed and that American invulnerability was gone. Just as was the case after the Japanese attack, September 11th seemed to change the degree to which and the way in which the United States engaged with the rest of the world. I can tell you that's certainly true. It just caused a shift in how you really considered America's relationship with the world. But moving on. The most obvious effect on U.S. foreign policy were the trade offs that a war on terrorism required. Stopping terrorism became the country's top priority in the way that stopping communism was during the Red Scare. There was now a new premium on Russian and Chinese cooperation. Also important was securing the support of moderate Arab states like Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, whose populations could oppose cooperation with the United States so long as Washington maintained strong support for Israel and sanctions on Iraq. It's a mess. And foreign policy is something that is going to continue to evolve and develop. So, yesterday in part one, we talked about Washington's farewell address, the Monroe Doctrine, the open door policy, the Roosevelt corollary, dollar diplomacy, Wilsonian diplomacy. Today we talk good neighbor policy, Truman Doctrine, Eisenhower, détente, and the war on terror. What you're going to do now is going to go to your classwork section. It's this video is going to be posted here, and then right there, week 2, day 4 assignment. I'll show it to you right now. It's got a copy for each of you, and farewell address, years, and then the significance. It's that simple. So I know these lessons were kind of boring, a little bit slow. Thanks for staying with me, and keep up the great work.